I'm Kingsley Purdam. I'm a research fellow in social statistics, and I work on public consultation as part of the work I do. And I've actually ran citizens juries before, and I was always intrigued about them as a process in terms of the way they were set up and the kind of the progress or development people might take from where they started in their attitudes. So a person off the street, a lot of people who participate in a jury might have a firm view on an issue before they go on the jury, and that is one of the selection biases we might have to think about. But I was always intrigued by how they might adjust their attitudes through discussion, because it's quite an intensive process as citizens jury. So I've began to look at that height. So I'll just talk for a little while. I've got some example citizens juries reports you might want to have a quick look at. Okay, so this is a little quote from a citizens jury report, quite a recent one called Britain Thinks, and it was run by PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I think it was commissioned by the Treasury in a kind of roundabout sort of, we're not doing this but we've paid someone to do it through, and we just want to get a feeling. But this was one of the quotes that came up. So, through understanding the issues, the jury made a fundamental shift from wanting to punish those they believe responsible for the budget deficit to realising that the only way forward is as one. Now, what a miracle that must have been to have that happen in a short period of time. So, and Danish pastries is just a way of flagging something that will come up in a minute, because there's a little video of this little of this citizens jury. Sorry, it was quite high profile, but there's a little video. It was a very recent citizens jury about how to go about cutting public spending, and it was attached to another methodology. Quite often citizens juries are attached to other methods, either before or after. And I think one of the issues we need to think about is how objective they are and how the information is utilised. So, what are they? So we'll look at what they do and how they work, and what sort of policy areas they've looked at. How do you set one up in case you're thinking of running your own? Some people actually set their own up. Big undertaking. How can the data be analysed? How do they link with other methods, and what are their strengths and weaknesses? And then what resources there are for thinking about them as a research method. So they're usually involved in the UK. There's different ones around the world. In the States they use quite commonly, I would say, and across different types of policy sectors. In the UK there's kind of more recent innovation, and they usually involve volunteers, although people do get paid, usually get paid a fee of some sort. So in the jury I ran, I think people were getting £70–80 a day. So that adds to the costs of the undertaking, and you might have 12 to 16 people, and I suppose the principle is, if you're looking at it as it is conceived, is it's to get citizens and the policymakers face to face, alongside with the experts. Experts present the evidence, they might have their own view of course, and then the policymakers and researchers go through a stage of deliberation, usually in relation to a very specific issue, okay, just like a jury is in a court of law. And the citizens are enabled and encouraged to engage in the debate and then reach a verdict or a decision or a set of recommendations. And they're often used along other research techniques and methods, such as surveys or a citizens panel, which might be, so a local authority might run a citizens jury on the basis of its findings from its panel of citizens. So the uniqueness, arguably, about a citizens jury is that it involves citizens developing their knowledge and asking questions of expert witnesses, and collective group discussions. So the theory is really around deliberation, okay, and you hear lots of debates, whichever government it is, usually about engaging the public more closely in the policy making process, and it's given different justifications. So quite common under New Labour to use citizens juries and about connecting the citizens with the policymakers. Recent examples that I've come across include this recent high profile one about examining the cuts in public service spending, balancing work and family life, NHS care provision, well-being of young people, etc., etc. And so in this What Is session, I'll just go over how you might run a citizens jury and some of the debates about how to utilise the data, some of the limitations, some of the advantages. So, citizens jury, and there is some flexibility. No one would say you haven't done that right, I don't think, about citizens jury. You just have to justify the way you've gone about it, but they're usually quite intensive, so it might be 1 or even through to 4 days. 12 to 16 citizens usually, and they're recruited to reflect the population, and as you notice they're both in speech marks because there is some debate to what extent you can do that within a small number of people, and this selection process that takes place. I'll talk a bit about recruitment in a second, and when the jurors arrive there might be a pre-survey of their attitudes. This is after selection usually, because you wouldn't select people by attitude, you'd select them by, say, demographics. And then when they arrive you might do a pre-attitudinal survey. Say you just arrived for a citizens jury now, you might do an attitude survey of you, and then we might do an attitude survey at the end and see how your views might have changed or evolved. It's set up like a courtroom, so experts come in and to and fro, in and out of the front. The jurors sit there all day. They might have little group sessions, but it's set up like a courtroom. It's usually not in a court, but it's just in a room such as this, but it would be set up like that. So an expert witness might come in. So an expert witness might be an academic, might be someone who works in an agency. Say you were doing something around childcare, Sure Start centres. So an expert witness might be there, someone from a Sure Start centre, or someone who works with the welfare of children, or an academic who works in the area. And you probably have a range of those. The juror members can request other experts and other information, and that's taken very seriously within the format of the jury. You have a facilitator. Obviously that's someone who sits at the front, keeps the timings, tries to keep some structure to the day, tries to enable the citizens to ask the questions. And you have something called citizens' friends, who they're supposed to be informed people who members of the jury can go to in the breaks or ask questions to when they feel like they might not have understood something, or if they've got a query. Then there's a series of deliberations, and the jury reaches a decision or recommendations, just like you would. So these are example policy areas. The citizens' juries I was involved with was for local authorities, but they're done by health organisations, government department, even schools do them sometimes with the pupils, research organisations, charities, regulated bodies, etc., etc. Okay. Here's some examples of citizens' juries. One was Action for Children, and as I say, they tend to be structured around 1 or 2 questions. So, how can government act to increase the well-being and happiness of children and young people in the UK? And it was run by Action for Children. There's a list of 3 questions which the jury would have been presented with on the day. They wouldn't have been told in advance those questions, but they might have been told the general subject area. And I've just listed the witnesses because I think the witnesses are a key feature of citizens' juries. So it's always interesting to think about who they're bringing in, and sometimes this might be a compromise between who they want and who's available and who's prepared to come. But in this one, the Scottish Government Children's Services, there was an MP, an NHS spokesperson, children's service users and academic experts. Example 2, this is Andhra Pradesh in India, which there's printed copies of. And this was about the future of farming in India, and it was about consolidation of small farms, and jurors were asked to think about what the best way forward was. And the witnesses were government spokesperson, agricultural experts, academic experts, charities and journalists. Sometimes they bring in a journalist to give a kind of more reflective, perhaps, view. This is number 3. I think you've got this example as well. So this is, I'm not sure how to call it, but it's called Designer Babies. And so the questions were, should we be able to make choices regarding designer babies and genetic conditions, save siblings, to choose sex, and then to look at the phrase designer babies, whether it's a useful phrase. And the witnesses here were a fertility expert, NHS, parents with a genetic disorder, and representatives from disability charities. This is a local authority, and these were quite common actually, and they may be be used again in relation to having elected local mayors, and this was whether local authorities in the UK should have an elected mayor, which was in late 90s, early 2000. That was quite common. And the witnesses will be electoral service officers, governance expert from central government, local councils will be given their say as well. This is Buckinghamshire's Citizens Jury on Dementia Services. So, which dementia services does the jury believe should be prioritised over the next 18 months for development? And there's a list of options there, and the jury will be asked to debate those. And so the witnesses here were GPs, NHS service managers, dementia service users themselves. That's quite common to get service users in. Academic experts and leading charities. This is example 6. This is Leicestershire Rural Partnership, and the jury was tasked with discussing to recommend ways of ensuring that appropriate sustainable services are available to people in rural communities in Leicestershire. Views on current initiatives, proposals for new services, ways of increasing involvement. And the witnesses were retail expert, academic expert, local authority planning officer, etc., etc. I think you're getting the idea of this. This was family and work for the DTI, to develop policies that will support people juggling family and work commitments. And a list of witnesses there, sometimes stakeholders, sometimes independent experts. And this finally is this more recent PricewaterhouseCoopers, and this was entitled Choices and Trade-offs the Public Would Make When Cutting the Public Sector Spending, and this is the one we will sort of focus a bit more on, I suppose, overall. And the jury were tasked to consider the choices and trade-offs the public would make when cutting public sector spending, and to arrive at a set of citizens' criteria to guide decision making by the coalition government star chamber. So, first one was reducing shaping welfare, 2 for cutting departmental budgets, and 3 to assess and help refine a range of different ideas for transformative solutions. And this is where the quote came from I put up at the start. I'm not quite sure of the witnesses here, but Douglas Alexander was, who's essentially the Deputy Chancellor of Exchequer, was part of the formal sort of presentation of the findings. That's why it made me felt it was a government commissioned event. But anyway, I'm not sure of the witnesses there, but we will come back to this one. So now, example jury schedules, just to go back to the method, they're not for the faint-hearted, in the sense that it's very interactive. Like I'm sure if you speak to people who've done jury service, it's quite intensive. So this is an example schedule. So this is over 4 days. So you arrive at 10 a.m. and so this is for the coordinators, jurors and management group. There's no witnesses there, and it's kind of get to know you. Imagine if you're a citizen coming to this event, there will be some apprehension, I imagine, about participating in such event. And then there's 3 days of quite intensive discussion and debate. So you can see there where the expert witnesses present, and then there's more discussion and debate and reflection. Finally, on the final day, they'll have a session around conclusions and agree the process of writing the report, etc. So that is quite intensive. So the role of the citizen is to critically engage with witnesses, direct questioning of witnesses, scrutinise the evidence they might be presented with reports, and then to deliberate with each other over this extended period. They might do some work in small groups. I was just going to say a bit about the recruitment process. So they try to have some sort of random selection process from some sort of population frame, a bit like citizens jury service in a legal context. So I can just show you a recruitment letter that will just go out. So one of the questions is, I think, is how people get on the original population frame, and because that might have some biases in it itself. But a local authority might have a citizens panel of say 3,000 and decide to recruit the jurors from there. So a certain number of people will receive an invitation, and they might stratify it by age and gender. And a resident will get a letter like this through the post. So it would tell them about the event, tell them about how important it is, tell them about expenses, and a reasonable allowance for time, their time they give up. And so I think they then have a short list. We used to have a longer short list of people, and see of those who said yes, see here, we could try and reflect the population to some extent, but that's quite an arbitrary process. But that's how the recruitment would take place. And then they would have to think about their role, and they would be encouraged really to give their own views, but think about, you know, the people from where they live, their friends and family, but not articulate individual kind of cases. It's not a case of, oh, I'm worried about this is really affecting my family. It's to think in terms of being citizens. And that can be one of the issues, challenging issues of running a jury. And then they're asked to contribute to the decision and recommendations at the end of the session. Now, the role of the witness, as I say, they can be wheeled in and wheeled out. It's unlikely they'd have stayed for the whole event or been around for much of the day. They tend, in my experience, just to be there for their session. Okay, so they might be asked to come in and say, talk about changing the structure of Manchester City Council, give your perspective. You're the electoral registration officer, so you know about registration. Tell us about changing the voting system in Manchester. How do you think it would work? Would it work? Has it been tried in the past? These kind of things. So hands-on sort of expert view, or an academic might talk about a bigger picture and be able to mobilise some of the research evidence. They also might articulate their own view. Okay, so all academics have their own view on certain things. They claim to be driven by the evidence, but they will have their own view. And then respond to questions. And I think it does take some capacity building for some citizens just to be able to say it could be a government minister or a councillor or a journalist to have the confidence to ask questions, but that tends to grow through the jury process. I can just show you a letter of invitation. So the experts themselves probably won't have been on a citizens jury either, and so they do have some briefing. So this was about how to respond to localised flooding, and so this is the letter that is sent to the experts, inviting them to attend the jury, and some will say no, I'm not available. It just tells them about the jury process, and it tells them about their role of citizens. So if you're setting it up, you really want an expert who's got a viewpoint alongside the academic experts, perhaps, and the journalists. You really want someone who's got a view to try and generate some discussion, because that can be one of the challenges in a jury, that it just is very quiet. And you want to get this deliberative process working if you're approaching it in a genuine way. But you could read over that invitation to an expert. There's a little web reference there which you could follow up, but I won't quite do it now. The role of the facilitators and the citizens' friends. Well, the facilitator is to support the citizens, lead them through the process, moderate the discussions, keep an eye on the clock, ensure fairness. Okay, so they want to, in a jury, there may be a vote at the end, and they want to ensure everyone's voted. It might be a secret ballot, but in the process they want to make sure they've heard everyone's views, not just the person who's confident enough or has got the strongest views. They might support the question of the experts, and they'll really help in the framing of the decision or the recommendations at the end. As I say, the citizens' friends are really an additional source of expertise, or someone to help follow up questions or find some additional information. Now, the commissioning body, theoretically, they don't have an involvement in the process. It's supposed to be an objective process. So it's a bit like commissioning a survey, but then you going to do the field work or these kind of things. Now, for quality control, they might be in the background, but in theory, they shouldn't be part of the process. But it will be them who've usually set the framework for the decision, and it's important to think about how the decisions are framed, what choice architectures are being used, and by that I mean it's a bit like the referendum vote in Scotland. There's a huge amount of debate about how you've set that question, because that can predetermine some answers. So it's important to think about that, the politics of that process. And the commissioning body usually makes some commitment to responding to the outcomes. Okay, and that's important they don't overstate those claims, but that's one of the mobilisation factors for getting people involved. But it's very sort of courageous to say we're going to change policy because a citizens jury has said this. Because it's a small group of people. And so I think there has to be some balance there about the jurors' expectations and what can be claimed from a citizens jury. Now on the costs, I think you could calculate the costs if you wanted. If you think about the jurors are on maybe £100 a day, you've got all the infrastructure. So I think they would start at maybe £12,000–15,000 and go higher depending on the profile and the investment in the event. But they aren't cheap things to do. I think you could run them, if you're a student, you could run sort of pilot citizens juries. It would be interesting to do that. But so they're not cheap. So what is the data collected? Well, all sorts of things go on. Amazing things go on as part of this dialogue process, deliberation. So, you know, there's a kind of work that's excessive use of post-it notes all over the place, everywhere you look. Flip chart notes, you might do some video recording, you might have votes, secret ballots, interactive comments where people iterate. And it's all about reaching this final session where people either vote or come up with some recommendations. But our interest is kind of, from research methods perspective, is, well, how usable is this data? How do you translate it into something robust? And there are different ways of doing that. I'll talk about it in a second. One of the other outcomes is the fact that it's people involved engaged in a process. And one of the outcomes is that there's evidence to say that the participants, the citizens jurors, actually benefit considerably in terms of their kind of skill and confidence levels. But that is a peripheral outcome. Now, the findings are quite often used as part of other methods. So that pollution study there around flooding was used as a follow-up to a survey, some findings from a survey that were presented to the jury. The Britain Thinks public deficit study was used to frame questions for a survey. Okay, the advantages, well, it's direct citizens' input, arguably impartial and objective, it's interrogation of issues, experts and evidence, extended deliberation, a highly specific outcome or verdict, and it's a research process in itself. You're kind of learning what citizens think along the way. You can also observe how attitudes change during the process, and it can be used through other tools. Now, some of the limitations are that it's, in theory, they should be very specific. So it's a limited set of issues. It takes a considerable amount of expertise to run them, and also the organisation of the process and setting up the jury or the trial, if you want to call it that. Now, there's some debate about, as I've highlighted, about the framing of the decision. So what are the options that are presented to the jury? Okay, is it some choice constraints already there? So it's a bit like going to a cafe and being asked, do you want medium or large? So small is not something you're presented with, or regular. Understand? So that's a simple way of looking at choice constraints. Now, the deliberation process, there's some debate about how neutral that can be, and if you've been in focus groups, you may know you've got a feeling for people who may dominate the group or may not say very much, or these kind of things, and the way in which the moderator may lead the debate. There's a debate around the remit of the citizen themselves, how representative they can be, and in other kind of areas, not on citizens' juries, but in other kind of areas in qualitative research, there's been some evidence around strong opinion shifts. So people in small spaces for a certain amount of time tend to shift their opinions a little bit in relation to, say, the general view of a group, or these kind of experiences. But I haven't seen much evidence around citizens' juries around that. It's more around kind of psychology, group behaviour, experimental studies. Okay. The data and generalisability of data and selection bias is a key issue. So what, as I say, it may be grand thing to do to change the policy on the basis of a citizens' jury, but it gives the impression that that might be what is up for grabs, new policy. And related issues are lack of power, so you have to be clear about what legitimacy the jury is being given. And that's normally not always clear. Okay, to me, I've only ever seen them as consultation exercises rather than as decision-making bodies. And it could be the body themselves doesn't have the power to change the policy anyway. And so the debate is around whether they're really PR-driven or whether they truly are about public participation. And I'm sure you've read the theory around public participation and this ladder of participation where at the top is citizen control, the bottom is PR, consultation. So, but I think like any research, even government department research, if they don't like their findings, they might publish it in a different way to the one they were expecting than the one in which the consultants were expecting it to be published. You know, you see high-profile resignations, don't you, from academics who are working with government departments. So, I don't know, I think that is a minimum, and normally that is required. So you'll have some citizens who will be saying, where's the report from this citizens' jury which costs £15,000? What does it mean? Do you know what I mean? I think there will be some pressure, and I've seen that kind of, because the press sometimes follow them quite closely, you know, especially when there was such a new methodology. So the press would be reporting on what will be the outcome of this jury. Okay, so I'm just going to show you this little example overview, and it is actually a video, and you might have seen it was on the BBC. It's just a short few minutes. A video from this Britain Thinks.
Jury subjected to a barrage of...
Maybe some of the key thoughts around the challenges and opportunities.
A so-called citizens' jury subjected to a barrage of evidence, convened to sit in judgment on the state of the state.
Under the new coalition government, there are two major reforms happening.
The UK has quite a big demographic challenge coming.
Greater numbers of older people and fewer numbers of people of working age.
Deciding not if there should be cuts, but where those cuts would be. So pretty intensive work here over the past 4 days. But after all the PowerPoint presentations, the working groups, the seminars, the Danish pastries, where do they now think the act should fall? Do you buy the idea
so these people have been in the jury for 3 days,
and
this is the end of it. You can see the fatigue.
I think the problem is so huge that cuts need to be made in every area, full stop, and they need to be made quickly.
We spend a lot of money on welfare and benefits, and it's a welfare culture, and we need to change that.
In some circumstances, when people have been on benefits for years and years, and when I say, I hate to say it, become lazy, or perhaps they're depressed, there might be mental health issues there. I think in that case, yes, start slashing the benefits. You know, why on earth are hard-working taxpayers paying for unemployed to stay at home?
We're aware that there is in fact a considerable sort of substrata class which exists there, but it was encouraged very much by previous governments.
So would you like to see cuts in benefits, in essence, to force people back to work?
You've got to do that.
I think we all agreed that they should be just above the poverty line, so they should be getting just half of what they would on a standard job, and then that pushes them to want a better quality of life. So then they will
Just
be
to say,
going
this
back
is
into
at the
work.
end, this
And
is
that's
part of the
saves
jury.
money.
This
Yeah,
is just
so
the
cutting it by
journalists
maybe by
getting a
half.
feel for what
The jury's ideas on welfare reform are not just aimed at the poorest. They want the government to target the middle classes too, challenging the notion of universal benefits, a foundation stone of the welfare state. What about child benefit, for example?
Yes, that really should become means tested.
You shouldn't be paid for having children. Yeah, it's a privilege to have a child, not.
And if you can't afford it, don't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, the very wealthy, why on earth are they still
They
getting automatically?
They'd probably even put their hands up and say, we don't even need this.
What areas, if any, should be ring-fenced, should be protected?
Nothing at all.
Why ring fence something that can be savings in?
Mr Cameron has already announced that he was going to ring fence international aid. Why?
We need to look after ourselves first. We're in dire straits.
So the developing world has to look after itself.
For the time
But for
being,
the
yes,
time
certainly.
being, like, put it on hold. But we said international aid, but we also said defence is an area where maybe they could cut back, because we obviously have our soldiers in Afghanistan that need to be brought home.
And all the work has been for this, delivering their verdict to the man responsible for public spending, the self-styled Minister for Deficit Reduction, Liberal Democrat MP Danny Alexander.
In the view of this jury, nothing should be off the table.
The public need to understand how severe the crisis is.
We should not ring-fence the NHS.
And, for example, should reduce middlemen and bureaucracy.
The Citizens Jury aren't offering the government's agenda unconditional support. In one area, they're challenging a convention that neither the Tories, Lib Dem or Labour would touch with the proverbial barge pole.
Maybe raising the basic rate of tax to 23%, that was, even though everybody felt, obviously, that that's something that you want to try and avoid, but at the same time everybody felt that it would work and that people would be prepared to do it.
I mean, the tax that we chose to increase was VAT. So VAT will be going up from 17.5% to 20%. And we took the view that increasing income tax would also act as a disincentive to work, because people will be paying more.
It may not be music to their ears, but this focus group and this minister seem to be speaking the same language.
You know, £83 billion over a 4 year. We've already cut £6 billion out of people's budgets. VAT will be going up. What do we cut next year? £11 billion worth of savings. And what do we cut the year after that? Cut with care. How do we go further the year after that? We can make savings. And what do we do the year after that? Yeah, good presentation. Thank you.
As well as the Citizens Jury, PwC also commissioned a poll of 1,788 people to gauge their view of how to tackle the deficit. 58% want to see health spending protected, but 60% said there should be no ring fencing of international aid.
So that at the end was a focus group with the Deputy Chancellor's Exchequer around the findings. So I'm not sure what you've made about that, but I'll just say something for and against the critique. I think that was quite a standard example of a citizens' jury there. If you looked at kind of participants they try and involve, the debates that go on, but I was struck by the uniformity of people at the end, and you know, I think that adds to the debate around which way in which opinions can shift within a deliberative context, and there's quite a bit of theory about it. What we don't get to see there is people's attitudes before and after, which would be really interesting. And obviously it's very interesting for PricewaterhouseCoopers to get that kind of message from citizens. I mean, I think they would have been very pleased with that particular outcome, but that's, you know, we don't know about that process, but it certainly wouldn't be against what they might have been hoping for in terms of the way in which the government goes back to spending. So here's some for and against critique. So and you can follow these references, they're fully listed. So the citizens' jury process was one of the first and yet most thorough democratic processes created in the 20th century. So that sounds very positive. And then oppositely, citizens' jury deliberations do not involve a rational inquiry into the justification of and selection of values. Juries function as mechanisms for democratising the selection of values only in the very limited sense that they expose small groups to exercises in attitude change. And the final quote, I'm sure you'll know who that's from. This is not so for government, it's listening to people, and this is when Gordon Brown said he was going to have a huge number of citizens' juries to decide lots of public policy, but that never came to fruition. Okay, toolkit for citizens' juries. So you frame the issue and the agenda, you recruit the citizens, you pay them incentives, you give them briefing packs, some sort of training, some confidence building, you recruit the witnesses, you hold a venue, it's normally 1 to 2, 3 to 4 days, you obviously identify the budget, and then you've got hopefully an audience for the findings. So they do have a PR aspect in that sense as well. People are keen to hear what has been said, and but there's debates around the use of the data, how generalisable it is, and what can be claimed about it. Other options that I've seen increasingly used are juries online, virtual citizens' juries. Okay, people come together online at repeated times of the day, or debate online, and maybe might be a global. And then also reconvening a jury at a second point in time, almost a longitudinal perspective. So you might take that group that we've just seen and then bring them back together if they could bear to be in the same room. Actually, yeah. If mind you, they seemed like in agreement with each other, didn't they? Basically, so I'm sure they'd be happy to meet again. I mean, I think it is a big event for citizens. The people who are in it really feel like it takes over their life for that period. And here's some references here if you want to follow those up.